He came home from war with nothing but an aging German shepherd and a farm he planned to sell and forget. But on his very first night back, his dog stopped cold at the barn and refused to move. Someone was hiding there, and one small act of kindness would set off a chain of events that nearly cost him his land, his future, and the last piece of peace he had left. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Missoula, Montana sat under a sky that looked scraped thin, the kind of late winter light that made even noon feel hesitant. The Clark Fork River ran dark and fast beyond town, swollen with meltwater and edged with ice that refused to admit defeat. Wind came down from the hills with a clean, hard smell, pine pitch, wet stone, and the faint metal tang of coming snow. The streets were mostly quiet, but not empty. Missoula wasn't a ghost town. It was a place that kept moving while pretending it wasn't in a hurry, a place where people waved with 2 fingers off a steering wheel and still remembered who didn't come back from the last war, the last fire season, the last hard winter. On the outskirts, where the pavement gave up and gravel took over, the land opened into fields that looked bruised by cold. And there, beyond a bent mailbox and a fence line that had lost its straightness, Pine Hollow waited like a story nobody finished telling. Ethan Hale Mercer eased his truck off the main road and onto the rutted drive without swearing, without theatrics. He was 46, built solid but worn down in the ways that didn't show up on a scale. His shoulders still sat square out of habit, but the posture didn't come from pride. It came from years of learning that slack invited trouble. His hair, once a deep, almost black brown, had thinned at the crown and gone gray at the temples, clipped close because anything longer felt like a liability. A trimmed beard shadowed his jaw, more salt than pepper now, framing cheekbones that made his face look sharper than it was. Ethan's eyes were the part people noticed most, not cold, not cruel, just alert, like a porch light left on even after everyone claimed they were asleep. He didn't talk much. He wasn't shy. He just saved words the way he saved money, only for what mattered, because he'd learned what it felt like to run out. In the truck bed, Coda rode without shifting his weight, a German shepherd nearly 9 years old, black and tan coat thick against the Montana air. His muzzle had silvered, especially around the lips, but he still carried himself like an animal who believed in rules. His ears stood tall and responsive, and his amber eyes tracked the road edges, the tree line, the small movements a civilian would miss. Coda wasn't a pet in the simple sense. He'd served alongside Ethan overseas, trained to read space and sound the way Ethan read people, for intent, for tension, for what didn't add up. Now his pace was slower and his joints needed a moment before jumping down, but his mind remained sharp, a quiet blade. Ethan stopped the truck near the fence line because the driveway ahead had collapsed into a muddy trench. He killed the engine and sat still for a beat, hands resting on the steering wheel longer than necessary. Silence filled the cab, interrupted only by the wind pushing against the glass. Through the windshield, the farmhouse stood with the resigned posture of something that had endured neglect without ever getting the courtesy of a goodbye. The paint that used to be white had faded into a chalky gray, peeling in curled strips like old paper. One window was boarded over, another hung crooked in its frame. The roof sagged on the east side where ice had likely sat too long, and the porch steps leaned as if they were tired of pretending to be safe. Ethan opened the door and stepped out, boots sinking into wet ground that didn't quite freeze, didn't quite thaw. Cold didn't bother him the way it bothered other people. It had bothered him once, years ago, when he still believed discomfort was an emergency instead of a fact. Now it just registered like information. What hit harder was the smell. Damp wood, old dust, and something faintly sweet beneath it, like hay that had dried and re-dried so many times it became part of the building itself. Coda jumped down with practiced control, landing softly despite his size. He didn't rush ahead. He stood beside Ethan, head lifted, tail still, surveying the property in a slow sweep. Ethan didn't need to speak to understand what his dog was doing. Coda wasn't looking for fun. He was clearing a room the size of a farm. They walked together toward the house. The porch boards creaked under Ethan's weight and answered back with a familiar complaint. Inside, the air was stale but not dead. Dust hung in the thin light coming through bare windows, and the living room looked smaller than Ethan remembered, as if memory had inflated it the way loneliness inflates everything you leave behind. A couch with worn arms still sat against the wall. The coffee table still bore old ring stains. It wasn't abandoned in the dramatic way Ethan expected. It was simply paused, like someone had stepped out for a minute and never came back. Ethan set his duffel down and moved through the rooms with the same method he'd used in unfamiliar buildings overseas. Check corners, note exits, mark hazards. The kitchen sink held a few rust-stained dishes. The cabinet smelled faintly of soap that had long since lost its bite. In the corner, a faded towel hung on a hook, one of his mother's, he realized, because she always folded towels the same way, edges aligned like a small promise that order could exist even when life didn't. His mother, Willa Mercer, had been a slim woman of average height, the kind of person who looked delicate until you watched her carry 2 grocery bags in each hand without a pause. She'd had chestnut brown hair that she wore loose when she could and tied back when work demanded it, strands escaping no matter what she did. Her skin was pale but sun-touched from years of gardening, and her hands always smelled faintly of dish soap and soil. Willa smiled easily but worried quietly, the worry living behind her eyes like a lantern lit in a back room. She had fed people the way other people offered opinions, without being asked, without expecting applause. His father, Grant Mercer, had been built broader, a man with a heavy brow and forearms that looked carved by tools. He kept his beard trimmed close and his shirts patched rather than replaced, not out of poverty alone, but principle. Grant wasn't unkind. He simply believed affection should be shown through action. He fixed what broke. He didn't talk about feelings because, after the mill laid him off years ago, his words had started to feel expensive. That layoff hadn't made him bitter, not outwardly. It had made him quieter, more private, the way a man becomes when he learns the world can erase stability with a signature. Ethan stood at the kitchen counter and let his palm rest there a moment, feeling the scarred wood under his skin. He hadn't come to grieve. He'd come to make a transaction, clean, list, sell, leave. That plan still sat in his mind, neat and reasonable. It would have stayed that way, too, if the house hadn't felt like it was holding its breath. A drip drew his attention upward. Water spotted the ceiling in a dark stain, and a slow leak tapped into a pot on the floor with the steady patience of time itself. Ethan exhaled through his nose. Roof repair meant money. Money meant jobs. Jobs meant more time spent away. And he'd already lived too much of his life away from places that asked him to stay. Coda moved through the kitchen with his nose low, tracing scent in slow arcs. He didn't behave like a dog exploring a new home. He moved like an officer reading a report. When Ethan stepped back outside toward the barn, Coda followed without hesitation, his shoulder close enough to brush Ethan's leg. It was an old pattern, one that had kept them alive. The barn sat slightly left of the house, weathered red boards gone dull and raw, one corner leaning like it had finally admitted exhaustion. Ethan pulled the heavy door open. Hinges groaned in protest, a sound that echoed through the empty space like a warning. Inside, the air was colder and smelled of damp hay and old animals. Dust rose in thin streams through the beam of light cutting in from the door. Ethan's eyes adjusted. He saw cracked beams, a sagging loft, told himself again he wasn't staying long enough to care. Then Coda stopped. It wasn't a casual pause, it was a full-body decision. His ears angled forward, his spine went rigid, his tail held perfectly still. He stared at the far wall, where the wood looked darker, older, reinforced in a way that didn't match the rest of the structure. Ethan felt a tightening in his chest, not fear exactly, recognition. The sensation that something was present even if it didn't move. Ethan's hand drifted toward his jacket pocket out of reflex, fingers curling around nothing useful. He didn't draw anything. He didn't call out. He watched Coda, because Coda was rarely wrong about the shape of danger. The barn held small signs Ethan hadn't noticed at first. Scuffed dirt that looked freshly disturbed, Hay pushed aside in a way wind couldn't manage, the faintest trace of smoke that didn't belong to rot or age. Ethan took one slow step forward. Coda didn't block him. He stayed close, shoulder nearly against Ethan's leg, an unspoken message. Something here, but not an immediate threat. Not yet. Ethan swallowed, forced his breathing steady, and stepped back. He closed the barn door quietly, not out of cowardice, but out of choice. Some things were better approached with daylight, a plan, and a clear head. He leaned his forehead briefly against the wood and shut his eyes. He had come to Pine Hollow to get rid of it, the way a man throws away a reminder he doesn't know how to carry. But the farm didn't feel like property now. It felt like a question, and Coda, old, steadfast Coda, had just pointed at the part of the question that refused to stay buried. Ethan turned back toward the house. The wind moved through the broken fence slats, making them whisper against each other like thin bones. Behind him, Coda followed. Calm again, but watchful, as if guarding not the land, but Ethan's next choice. Ethan didn't know what waited inside that barn. He only knew this. The moment Coda stopped, leaving stopped being simple. Morning arrived in Missoula without ceremony. A pale light filtering through low cloud cover that made the world look unfinished. The temperature hovered just above freezing, enough to soften yesterday's mud into a thick, treacherous paste. Ethan woke on a narrow mattress he had dragged into the living room, his body stiff in the familiar places, lower back, shoulders, the old knot beneath his left shoulder blade that never quite released. For a few seconds he lay still, listening. The house answered with small sounds, a tick from the cooling stove, the soft creak of wood settling, wind worrying the loose siding like a persistent thought. Coda was already awake. The German shepherd stood near the front door, weight balanced evenly on all four paws, ears angled forward. His breathing was slow and quiet, but his eyes were alert, tracking something Ethan couldn't yet hear. The dog had repositioned himself during the night so that he could see both the hallway and the kitchen, a habit learned long before this farm. It wasn't guarding in the theatrical sense. It was presence, steady, intentional. Ethan swung his legs off the mattress and pulled on his boots without comment. He didn't speak to Coda. Words were unnecessary when routine said everything. Outside, the air cut cleanly into his lungs, sharp with pine and cold earth. The barn stood exactly where he'd left it, its door shut, its silhouette leaning against the morning like a tired man bracing himself. Ethan brewed coffee strong enough to be useful and drank it standing by the window, eyes on the yard. He had promised himself he would return to the barn in daylight, with clarity instead of impulse. Daylight did not soften what waited there. It only made the edges clearer. When he crossed the yard, Coda stayed tight to his side. The mud sucked at Ethan's boots, and he adjusted his stride, mindful of balance. The barn door resisted again, wood swollen from moisture, but it opened with a groan that echoed inside. Dust rose in a lazy spiral. The far wall looked the same as it had yesterday, darkened boards, reinforced seams. But now Ethan noticed other things. A crate pulled slightly out of alignment. A coil of rope moved from where it would have fallen if no one had touched it in years. "Hello," Ethan said, his voice even, pitched low so it wouldn't carry like a challenge. "I'm not here to start trouble." Silence answered him, thick and deliberate. Coda stepped forward first, not fast, not tense, stopping several feet from the wall. He lowered himself to the dirt floor and lay down, head on his paws, a posture that meant one thing and one thing only. There is something living here, and it is not an enemy. A figure shifted behind stacked crates, then another. The man who stepped out first was tall but stooped, his posture shaped by years of labor that had finally demanded payment. He looked to be in his late 60s, with a face lined deeply enough to suggest both weather and worry had taken turns with it. His hair was thin and gray, combed back with care that spoke of pride rather than vanity. A beard, once dark, now mostly white, framed a mouth set in a habitual line of restraint. His clothes, heavy work pants patched at the knees, a flannel shirt faded into softness, were worn but clean. His hands were large and scarred, fingers stiff as if the joints argued with every movement. Behind him stood a girl, no more than 10, maybe 11. She was small for her age, thin in a way that suggested careful rationing rather than neglect. Her hair was light brown, pulled into a low ponytail that had come loose overnight, strands framing a pale face dusted with freckles. Her eyes were dark and watchful, fixed on Ethan with a readiness that didn't belong to children who felt safe. She stood close enough to the man that her sleeve brushed his elbow, close enough to retreat behind him if needed. The man lifted one hand, palm open. "We'll go," he said before Ethan could speak. His voice was steady, but the effort behind it was visible, like a muscle held too long. Didn't mean any harm, just needed somewhere dry. Ethan didn't answer right away. He took in the distance between them, the girl's position relative to the man, the way the man angled his body just slightly, shielding without advertising it. He'd seen that posture before, in villages overseas, in shelters stateside, anywhere people learned to protect what mattered without drawing attention. Coda shifted his head and looked back at Ethan once, amber eyes calm, then returned his gaze to the girl. The dog didn't move closer. He did not retreat. He stayed exactly where he was, a quiet bridge across the space between fear and possibility. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Nobody's leaving right now," he said. The words surprised him with their weight. "Let's start with names." The man hesitated, then nodded. "Gus Rourke," he said. "This is my granddaughter, Maisie." Maisie didn't speak. She dropped her gaze to Coda, studying the silver at his muzzle, the stillness of his body. After a moment that felt longer than it was, she took a small step forward and knelt beside him, her fingers pressed into the thick fur along his neck. Coda didn't flinch. He didn't lean into her either. He simply stayed, solid and warm. Maisie's shoulders began to shake. She cried without sound, the way children do when they've learned that noise can make things worse. Gus turned his face away, jaw tight, breathing measured. Ethan looked at the far wall and waited. When Maisie's shaking slowed, he spoke again. "You can come inside," he said. "It's warmer." The house felt smaller with more people in it, but also less hollow. Ethan set a kettle on the stove, working around the flicker of an old light that threatened to give out if challenged. Gus moved carefully, favoring one leg, and Ethan noticed the way his back stiffened when he bent, pain managed through habit rather than denial. Maisie sat at the kitchen table, hands folded in her lap, eyes tracking exits and corners. Coda positioned himself near her chair, close enough to be reassuring without crowding. They ate simply, soup thinned with water, bread cut into careful portions. Gus spoke plainly when he spoke at all. He had worked most of his life in timber, felling, hauling, maintaining equipment until a logging accident years back had crushed part of his spine. The injury ended steady work and taught him the limits of his own body. Maisie's mother, his daughter, had died 2 winters ago after a long illness that drained savings and options alike. There was no father to call, shelters hadn't worked, too many questions, too much risk of separation. So they kept moving until Pine Hollow offered a roof that didn't ask for explanations. Ethan listened without interruption. He recognized the economy of Gus's words, the way facts replaced feelings when feelings felt dangerous. Maisie finished her soup and pushed the bowl forward, then folded her hands again, posture too polite, too careful. "You can stay," Ethan said finally. "Not forever. We'll figure out what comes next, but you can stay." Gus opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded once. "We won't be trouble," Ethan almost smiled. "Trouble's rarely loud," he said. "Mostly it's expensive." The afternoon passed with small adjustments. Gus helped where he could, fixing a loose hinge with quiet competence. Maisie stayed near Coda, shadowing his movements like a second tail. Ethan checked the roof from outside and confirmed what he already knew. The leak had spread. It would need money he didn't have yet. As evening settled, a truck slowed on the road beyond the fence. Ethan watched it pass, unease pricking at the back of his mind. Missoula was friendly, but it was also observant. People noticed new shapes in old places. That night, Ethan lay awake listening to rain tap against the patched roof. Coda slept near the kitchen doorway, one eye open, breathing deep and steady. Ethan stared at the ceiling stains spreading like a map and wondered when kindness had started to feel like a calculated risk. He didn't regret letting them stay. Regret came later when choices collected interest. Outside, the barn stood silent, holding its secrets. Inside, 3 lives and an old dog shared space that felt suddenly fragile and profoundly human. Ethan closed his eyes, knowing one thing for certain. Pine Hollow was no longer empty, and emptiness had been the only part of the plan that felt safe. By the third morning, Pine Hollow had learned new rhythms, and none of them were gentle. The cold lingered longer inside the house now that more bodies shared the space, breath fogging faintly in the kitchen before the stove warmed the air. Ethan woke before dawn out of habit, not alarm, and lay still for a moment listening to sounds that hadn't been there a week ago. The soft rustle of Maisie turning in her sleep on the couch, Gus's muted cough carried from the back room, the steady, reassuring cadence of Coda's breathing near the doorway. Outside, snow had fallen overnight, not enough to soften the land, just enough to complicate it. A thin white crust clung to the fields and fence rails, highlighting every break and sag. The sky was a dull, unbroken gray, pressing low, as if it expected something from the ground and was willing to wait until it got it. Ethan dressed quietly and stepped onto the porch. The cold bit harder this morning, the kind that found gaps in clothing and memory alike. He walked the perimeter of the yard, checking the fence out of habit more than necessity. Pine Hollow had never been fully enclosed, but now the gaps felt louder. Staying, he realized, wasn't a single decision. It was a series of small commitments that stacked themselves into weight. When he came back inside, Gus was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he hadn't brewed himself. In daylight, Ethan could see the details he'd missed before, the way Gus's left shoulder sat slightly lower than the right, compensating for an old injury. The network of fine scars across his knuckles, the careful economy of his movements. This was a man who had learned to live inside limits without announcing them. "Didn't want to wake you," Gus said, voice rough from sleep and cold. "Figured I'd get the kettle going." Ethan nodded once. "You sleep all right?" Gus gave a small, non-committal shrug. "I've slept worse." Maisie appeared in the doorway a moment later, wrapped in a sweater that hung too big on her narrow frame. Her hair was still tangled from sleep, ponytail abandoned, freckles standing out against skin pale from winter and worry. She glanced at Ethan, then at Coda, who lifted his head at once. Only after the dog acknowledged her did she relax enough to step fully into the room. Breakfast was sparse, oatmeal stretched thin, bread rationed carefully. Ethan noticed how Gus waited until Maisie had finished before touching his own bowl, how Maisie slowed her eating as if trying to make the food last by sheer will. The awareness tightened something in Ethan's chest he didn't have a name for anymore. After breakfast, Ethan pulled on his jacket and reached for his keys. "I've got work lined up," he said, more statement than reassurance. "Fence repair out by the river, pays cash." Gus straightened slightly. "I can help," he said quickly, then hesitated. "At least with the lighter stuff." Ethan shook his head. "Not today." He didn't add what they both understood, that Gus's back wouldn't forgive him, and forgiveness was expensive. Outside, Coda followed Ethan to the truck and jumped into the bed with practiced care, pausing a fraction longer than he used to before landing. Age showed itself in moments like that, brief but undeniable. Ethan noticed, filed it away, and said nothing. The job by the river took longer than promised. The fence posts were rotted deeper than they looked, and the ground near the Clark Fork was half frozen, half mud, fighting every attempt to set something straight. By the time Ethan finished, his hands were numb despite his gloves, and his shoulders burned with the familiar ache of overuse. The man who paid him, a stocky rancher with a red face and a beard that seemed to have grown wild after too many winters alone, counted out the bills carefully, apologized for not having more, and offered eggs instead. Ethan took both. Pride didn't keep anyone warm. When he returned to Pine Hollow, the house felt different again, not worse, just heavier. Gus was bent over a loose cabinet hinge, working slowly, methodically, movements precise, despite the tremor that crept into his hands when he held them still. Maisie sat at the table with a stack of old papers Ethan had pulled from a drawer, receipts, faded manuals, envelopes long past relevance, organizing them into neat piles for reasons she didn't explain. Coda lay at her feet, head resting on one paw, eyes tracking the room with quiet vigilance. The electricity flickered twice that afternoon, long enough to reset the clock on the stove and remind Ethan how fragile the systems here really were. He checked the breaker box and found wiring that should have been replaced a decade ago. Another problem. Another number. The mail arrived late, delivered by a county truck that slowed just enough to be noticed. Ethan retrieved the envelope after it had gone, the paper stiff and official against his fingers. He didn't open it right away. He set it on the counter and finished what he was doing, as if delaying the inevitable could somehow dilute it. It couldn't. The notice was brief and precise: overdue property taxes, a timeline, consequences outlined without malice or mercy. Ethan read it twice, then folded it carefully and slid it back into the envelope. He didn't curse. He didn't pace. He sat down at the table and stared at the wood grain as if it might rearrange itself into a solution. Gus noticed, of course. He always noticed shifts in weather and men alike. "Bad news?" he asked quietly. "Not new news," Ethan replied, "just louder." That evening, the snow melted into rain, tapping insistently against the patched roof. A drip reappeared in the kitchen, faster than before. Ethan set a pot beneath it and watched the water collect, each drop marking time he didn't have. Gus retreated to the back room early, fatigue settling into his bones. Maisie curled up on the couch with a book she wasn't really reading, one hand resting absently on Coda's shoulder. Ethan stood at the window, looking out at the barn silhouetted against the dark. The far wall lay hidden in shadow, but he could feel its presence the way one feels an unanswered question. Staying had already begun to cost him. Money, yes, sleep, certainty, and something else, something harder to measure. He wondered briefly if kindness could be rationed the way food could, if he could draw a line that protected everyone without bleeding himself dry. The thought felt practical. It also felt wrong. Later that night, when the house had settled into uneasy quiet, Gus approached him in the kitchen. He held his hat in both hands, turning it slowly. "We won't stay long," he said. "I see what this is doing to you." Ethan met his gaze. He saw the pride there, battered but intact, and the fear beneath it, fear of being the reason something broke beyond repair. "We'll take it one step at a time," Ethan said. "That's all I can promise." Gus nodded, not satisfied but respectful of the boundary. He turned back toward the hallway, steps careful. Ethan remained where he was, listening to the rain, the drip, the breathing of an old dog who refused to sleep too deeply when others depended on him. The plan he'd arrived with, sell, leave, simplify, felt distant now, like a map to a country that no longer existed. Pine Hollow was asking something of him, not loudly. Not all at once, just steadily. And he was beginning to understand that the true cost of staying would not announce itself up front. It would arrive in increments, quiet and relentless, demanding not heroics but endurance. The first sign that Pine Hollow had begun to attract attention came not with a knock, but with the sound of tires slowing on gravel. Ethan heard it from inside the house, a subtle change in pitch that made his shoulders tighten before his mind caught up. He set down the wrench he'd been using to coax life back into a stubborn drawer and moved to the window. A dark SUV sat near the fence line, too clean for the road it had taken, its engine still running as if the driver disliked committing to a place for longer than necessary. Coda was already there, standing at Ethan's side, ears angled forward, posture alert but controlled. He did not bark. He did not growl. He watched. The woman who stepped out moved with a practiced economy, heels navigating mud without sinking, coat cut sharply enough to suggest purpose rather than warmth. She looked to be in her early 40s, tall and slender, with dark hair pulled into a low knot at the nape of her neck. Her face was angular, cheekbones prominent, mouth set in a line that could pass for pleasant if one didn't look too closely. Her eyes were pale, gray or blue depending on the light, and missed very little. This was someone accustomed to rooms where decisions happened quietly and consequences arrived later. She closed the car door gently and waited. Ethan stepped onto the porch. He didn't rush. He didn't linger. Coda followed and stopped half a step behind him, a familiar position that made the message clear without spectacle. "Ethan Hale Mercer," the woman said, as if confirming something already decided. "Sloan Wexler." She extended a hand. Ethan wiped his palms on his jeans before shaking it. Her grip was firm, brief, impersonal. "What can I do for you?" Sloane's gaze flicked briefly toward the barn, then the house, then the yard beyond. She cataloged the place with the ease of someone trained to see value and liability in the same glance. "I work with land acquisitions in Missoula and the surrounding counties," she said. "Agricultural properties, estates that have stalled. I keep an eye on places like this." Ethan waited. Silence had always been a better tool for him than confrontation. "I knew your parents," Sloane continued. "Not well, but well enough to know they were private people. Stubborn. They didn't ask for help." She smiled slightly, as if this were a shared joke. "That tends to complicate transitions." Ethan felt something tighten at the mention of them, but his expression didn't change. "What do you want?" Sloane clasped her hands in front of her, posture relaxed, almost sympathetic. "I want to make you an offer before circumstances narrow your options. Pine Hollow has deferred maintenance, back taxes, zoning questions." Her eyes flicked briefly toward the house again. "Occupancy concerns." Inside, Maisie watched from the doorway, fingers curled into the hem of her sweater. Gus stood behind her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder, his posture subtly angled to block her from view. He had gone still in the way men did when they sensed weather turning. Coda took one step forward, placing himself squarely between Sloane's line of sight and the doorway. He did not bare his teeth. He simply existed, solid and unignorable. Sloane noticed. Her eyes lingered on the dog, assessing. "He's well trained," she said. "Military?" Ethan nodded once. "Like me." "Figures." She turned her attention back to Ethan. "Here's the situation. I can purchase this property at a price that reflects its current condition. I'll assume the tax burden, handle the paperwork, clean the slate. You walk away without further complication." "And the people here?" Ethan asked. Sloane tilted her head. "That's part of the complication I'm offering to remove." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Not interested." For the first time, Sloane's expression shifted, not to anger, but to calculation. "I think you should reconsider," she said evenly. "The county has processes, inspectors, timelines. Anonymous reports tend to surface when properties fall out of alignment. I'd hate for you to be caught off guard." She let the implication settle, then stepped back toward her car. "My card," she said, setting it on the porch rail. "You don't strike me as a man who enjoys surprises." She left as quietly as she'd arrived, the SUV disappearing down the road without throwing gravel. The yard felt larger afterward, emptier in a way that had nothing to do with space. That afternoon, the second sign arrived. A county truck pulled in just past noon, followed by a smaller sedan with official markings. Two men stepped out. The first was Harold Bennett, a county assessor Ethan recognized from years back. A thin man in his late 50s with graying hair combed too carefully and glasses that slipped down his nose when he was nervous. Harold had always been polite, rule-bound, the kind of man who believed deeply in procedure because procedure had once protected him from something personal. The second man was younger and broader, boots scuffed from use, badge clipped to his belt. His name, he said, was Evan Cole, land use inspector. He had a square jaw shadowed with stubble and eyes that didn't linger, trained to observe without inviting conversation. This was a man who followed the book not because he enjoyed authority, but because deviation had cost him something once. Ethan saw it in the way Evan kept his voice neutral, his distance exact. "Routine inspection," Evan said. "We received a report." Ethan nodded. "Of course you did." They walked the property together. The barn, the roof, the wiring. Ethan answered questions plainly. Yes, the roof leaked. Yes, the barn leaned. Yes, there were additional occupants. No, there was no lease. No, there was no formal agreement. Gus stood near the house, hat in hand, face composed. Maisie remained inside with Coda, who sat by the window, eyes fixed on the men outside. His body was still, but his presence filled the room like a held breath. Harold scribbled notes, his pen moving faster as the list grew. Evan took photographs, explained requirements, timelines, consequences. His words were professional, not unkind, but the meaning beneath them was heavy. Compliance would require money, repairs, documentation, time Ethan did not have. When they left, Harold paused at the edge of the yard. "I know this is difficult," he said quietly, "but the county has to follow procedure." Ethan met his gaze. "So do I." The truck drove away. Silence rushed in to fill the space it left. Gus approached slowly. "We should go," he said. "This isn't your mess, it's mine." Ethan shook his head. "It isn't." "It is," Gus insisted, voice steady but strained. "I've lived long enough to know when I'm the weight tipping the scale." Maisie appeared behind him, eyes wide, fear held tightly in check. Coda rose and moved to her side, pressing gently against her leg. The dog did not look to Ethan for instruction. He stayed where he was, anchoring her. "We're not leaving today," Ethan said. The words came out firmer than he expected. "We'll figure this out." That evening, another envelope waited in the mailbox, thinner this time. Inside was a notice requesting compliance within a limited window. Failure would result in further action. Ethan read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it with the others on the kitchen table. Night fell early. Rain tapped against the roof again, the drip counting seconds like a metronome. Ethan sat alone at the table long after Gus and Maisie had gone to bed. Coda lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, breathing deep and even. Ethan thought of Sloane's calm certainty, the way pressure had arrived, not with shouting, but with timing and ink. He thought of his parents and the choices they'd made quietly, without permission. He wondered if he was honoring them or simply repeating a pattern that ended in exhaustion. The barn loomed outside, dark and patient. The far wall remained unexamined, a presence that tugged at the edge of his attention. Ethan didn't go to it, not yet. Pressure had found Pine Hollow, not by accident and not without intent. Ethan understood that now. The question was no longer whether staying would cost him. It was how much more it was willing to take. The decision did not announce itself with raised voices or slammed doors. It arrived folded, quiet, and deliberate, the way final decisions often did for men who had learned that noise only attracted trouble. Ethan found it on the kitchen table at dawn, placed carefully beside the stack of envelopes that had begun to feel like a second set of dishes, always there, always waiting to be dealt with. The paper was torn from an old spiral notebook, the edges rough, the handwriting neat but slightly slanted, as if the writer's hand had tired near the end. Ethan stood there longer than he meant to, the words settling into him with a weight that bypassed anger and went straight to something colder. "Ethan, we'll be gone by nightfall. You've already done more than enough." The house was still. Too still. The kind of stillness that followed a choice already made. He knew, before he even turned his head, that Gus was awake. Gus Rourke stood near the backroom doorway, canvas bag at his feet, shoulders squared in a way that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with resolve. In the gray light of early morning, he looked older than he had the night before. Deep lines ran from his nose to the corners of his mouth, carved by decades of wind, work, and the long habit of holding things in. His beard had been trimmed close, white now with only traces of its former color, a small act of dignity he allowed himself when he felt control slipping elsewhere. His flannel shirt was buttoned carefully. His boots were laced. He had dressed to leave. Maisie stood several steps behind him, frozen near the couch. She wore her jacket already. The sleeves too long, the zipper half closed because her hands were shaking too badly to finish the job. Her eyes were wide and glossy, breath coming in short pulls that made her shoulders lift and fall too fast. She clutched the strap of her backpack to her chest, as if it were the only solid thing left in the room. Coda was with her. The German shepherd lay on the floor at Maisie's feet, his body pressed firmly against her legs, weight deliberate, grounding. His muzzle had gone almost entirely silver now, and when he lifted his head the movement was slower than it once had been, but his eyes were clear. He watched Gus, then Ethan, then Maisie, taking in the room as if committing it to memory. His tail did not move. Ethan set the paper down carefully. "You don't have to do this," he said. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. Gus shook his head once. "I do." He bent slightly to pick up the bag, then straightened again, pain flashing across his face before he mastered it. "The county's watching. That woman, Wexler, she didn't come here to make conversation. She came to wait me out. And she will." Maisie made a sound then, a small, broken noise that slipped out before she could stop it. She crossed the room in 2 quick steps and wrapped her arms around Gus's waist, pressing her face into his sweater. Her body shook violently, the restraint she'd learned failing all at once. "No," she said. The word barely formed at first, then louder, frantic. "Please, Grandpa, please." Gus closed his eyes. His hand hovered for a moment, then rested on the back of her head, fingers spreading through her hair as if trying to anchor them both. "I promised your mom I'd keep you safe," he said softly, "and right now, safe means moving." Coda shifted, placing more of his weight against Maisie, his presence absorbing the tremors she couldn't stop. He did not whine. He did not intervene. He simply stayed, steady as breath. Ethan felt something tear loose in his chest. Anger flared, not at Gus, not at Maisie, but at the system that made this feel inevitable, at the timing, at himself for not having an answer ready. He took a step forward, then stopped. Gus had already decided. Pressing now would only turn dignity into conflict. By mid-morning, they were gone. Ethan stood on the porch and watched Gus walk down the gravel road, the canvas bag slung over one shoulder, steps uneven but determined. The cold air carried the sound of gravel crunching under worn boots. Each step a punctuation mark Ethan could not interrupt. Gus did not look back. Not because he didn't care, but because looking back would have broken something he needed intact to keep going. Maisie sat on the porch steps after, knees drawn to her chest, jacket wrapped tight around her small frame. She did not cry anymore. She looked emptied out, grief exhausted into silence. Coda sat beside her, head resting lightly against her arm, eyes half closed but attentive, as if he could hold watch and comfort at the same time. The day stretched on without structure. Ethan tried to work, patched a loose board, checked the wiring again, but nothing held his attention. The farm felt different now, quieter but not lighter. Loss had weight, even when it removed bodies from a space. That afternoon, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow. Ethan found himself in the barn without fully deciding to go there, standing near the far wall where Coda had first stopped days earlier. The wood looked darker in the dim light, reinforced in a way that felt intentional. He ran his hand along the boards, fingers catching on a seam hidden beneath years of grime and dust. He stopped, not because he was certain of anything, but because the air felt held. Coda entered the barn behind him and sat abruptly, eyes fixed on the spot beneath Ethan's hand. Not tense, certain. Ethan's pulse quickened. He knelt, pressed his ear to the wood, and knocked lightly. The sound that came back was wrong, hollow, contained. His father's voice surfaced in his memory, not as sound, but as instinct. Hide important things where they belong, not where they're obvious. Ethan did not open it, not yet. He stood slowly, resting his forehead against the wood, breathing in the smell of old hay and cold earth. If there was something there, it had been placed deliberately. And if it had waited this long, it could wait a little longer. Right now there were other things breaking. Night fell early. The house creaked and sighed as temperatures dropped. Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table, the stack of envelopes spread before him like evidence, taxes, compliance notices, deadlines that did not care who left or why. He pressed his palms flat against the table and bowed his head. For the first time since he'd arrived, the weight of everything pressed down hard enough to make him question whether staying had been courage or stubbornness wearing a better coat. Coda rose and crossed the room, placing his head against Ethan's knee. The dog's breathing was slow, steady, warm. Ethan rested a hand on the coarse fur, fingers sinking in, grounding himself in something that did not demand explanations. Outside, the wind rattled the loose fence slats. Somewhere down the road, a truck passed, its headlights briefly cutting through the darkness. Life was moving on, indifferent and unstoppable. Ethan lifted his head. The farm had not asked him to save it, it had asked him to choose. And tonight, the choice felt heavier than it ever had, sharpened by absence and sealed by the quiet courage of a man who had walked away to spare someone else. The leaving had already happened. What remained was what Ethan would do with the space it left behind. The night did not release Ethan easily. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and restless, interrupted by the familiar drip in the kitchen and the quieter ache of absence. When morning arrived, it did so without apology. The sky over Missoula was a hard, washed-out blue, the kind that followed a cold front and promised no mercy. Frost glazed the fields, turning every blade of grass into something brittle and sharp. The air smelled clean in a way that hurt to breathe too deeply. Ethan rose before dawn, moving through the house like someone careful not to wake grief. The couch where Maisie had slept lay empty now, the blanket folded too neatly, as if tidiness might keep memory from spreading. He poured coffee he barely tasted and stood at the window, watching his breath fog the glass. Pine Hollow felt larger again, but not freer. The space Gus and Maisie left behind had weight, like a room after a funeral. Coda waited by the door, already alert. Age had slowed his joints, but not his awareness. His back legs stiffened when he stood, and he paused a moment longer before stepping forward, but his eyes were steady, intent. There was no confusion in him. Whatever had shifted in the house, he understood it as change, not loss. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and his jacket. He did not tell himself where he was going, because naming it would have turned it into a choice, and choices were heavy right now. Coda followed without hesitation. The barn greeted them with its familiar groan, the sound of wood and metal reminding the world it was still standing. Inside, the cold held tight, sharper than in the house, carrying the smell of hay, dust, and time. Sunlight slipped through cracks in the boards, striping the floor in pale gold. Ethan walked straight to the far wall. Up close, the difference was undeniable. The boards here were older, darker, reinforced not for strength alone but concealment. His father's work, without question. Grant Mercer had never trusted obvious hiding places. He believed in blending necessity into routine, secrets into structure. Coda stopped beside Ethan and sat, tail resting on the dirt, posture upright despite the stiffness in his hips. He did not look around. He looked at the wall. His certainty settled something in Ethan's chest. "All right," Ethan murmured, more to himself than the dog. He knelt and ran his hands along the seams, fingers finding what his eyes could not. A subtle gap, a nail head set slightly lower than the others. He pried carefully, working the board loose with the patience his father had taught him. Force broke things, precision revealed them. The wood gave with a soft crack, releasing a breath of air that smelled sealed and old. Behind the panel lay a narrow cavity beneath the barn floor. Inside, it rested a metal box, dulled by age but intact, edges wrapped in oilcloth yellowed with time. Ethan pulled it free and set it on the dirt floor. His hands trembled as he opened it, not from fear, but from the quiet understanding that nothing meaningful waited behind effort without cost. Inside were papers, carefully wrapped, and beneath them, bundles of cash held together with twine gone soft. Not a fortune, not a miracle, but enough to change the shape of a problem. Ethan unfolded the papers first. The handwriting stopped him cold. Willa Mercer's script was rounded and patient, the letters evenly spaced as if she had always believed the next word mattered just as much as the last. Grant's writing followed in places, firmer, more angular. The ink pressed harder into the page. They had written together. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then you stayed longer than you planned." Ethan swallowed. The words spoke plainly of Pine Hollow, of years when the farm had quietly taken in people who needed time more than charity. A mechanic who slept in his truck until he could stand again. A woman with a baby and nowhere else to go. A veteran who didn't talk much and needed a place where no one asked him to. His parents had never written these stories down elsewhere. They had never wanted credit. The money, the letter explained, was never meant to make life easy. It was meant to make it possible. "Land can be sold," Grant had written beneath Willa's words. "A place is only worth keeping if it keeps people." Ethan sat back on his heels, breath leaving him in a rush. Memory rearranged itself in his mind. His mother's endless cooking, his father's refusal to call certain people guests. This hadn't been stubbornness, it had been intention. Coda rose and stepped closer, resting his head against Ethan's shoulder. The dog's weight was solid, warm, grounding him back into the present. Ethan closed his eyes and let himself lean into it for a moment. Grief and relief braided together until he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. He replaced the panel carefully, setting the wall back into place as if nothing had changed. Some things were not meant to be displayed. They were meant to be carried. The day unfolded quickly after that, purpose returning in sharp, practical lines. Ethan drove into town with Coda in the truck bed, wind tugging at the dog's fur. He went first to the courthouse, where fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and the smell of paper and old coffee hung in the air. He spoke with the clerk, a thin woman in her late 40s with tired eyes and hair pulled back so tightly it suggested she did not waste time on softness. Her name tag read, Marianne Holt. She processed his payment without comment, then paused, surprised when the balance cleared in full. "Not many people do this without arguing," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "I've argued enough in my life." Next came repairs. He hired a roofer he knew from past jobs, Caleb Voss, a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with a sun-weathered face and a beard gone gray at the edges. Caleb spoke little and worked steadily, the kind of man who measured worth by whether something held. He didn't ask where the money came from. He just fixed the leak. By late afternoon, the drip in the kitchen stopped. Ethan stood beneath the repaired section and listened to the silence, surprised by how loud it felt. As dusk settled, a familiar figure appeared at the end of the drive. Gus Rourke stood there with his canvas bag, shoulders slumped now, exhaustion overtaking pride. He looked smaller somehow, as if the road had taken something with it. Ethan reached him halfway. "You didn't have to come back," Gus said, voice rough. "I did," Ethan replied. Gus studied his face, searching for signs of debt or regret. Whatever he found made him nod once. Relief flickered briefly across his features before he masked it out of habit. Maisie emerged from the truck moments later, hesitation breaking into a run when she saw Coda. She dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around the dog's neck, laughter bursting out of her like something she'd forgotten how to do. Coda accepted the embrace with dignity, tail thumping once against the ground. That evening, they sat together at the kitchen table, the house warmer now, the air steadier. Ethan told them only what they needed to know, that the taxes were handled, the roof fixed, that Pine Hollow wasn't going anywhere. He did not mention the box or the letters, not yet. Outside, the barn stood quiet, holding its history close. Ethan understood something then, with a clarity that surprised him. His parents had not left him land. They had left him permission to stay, permission to choose people even when the cost was real. The night settled over Pine Hollow, without rain, without warning, without threat. For the first time since Ethan returned, the farm did not feel like a question waiting for an answer. It felt like a responsibility already accepted. The first thing Ethan noticed after the repairs was not the silence, but the way sound changed. The house no longer swallowed noise the way it had before. Footsteps landed with purpose instead of apology. The wind no longer whistled through gaps in the roof. Pine Hollow had not become strong, but it had become honest about what it could hold. Morning brought motion. Gus settled into the rhythm of the place as if he had never left, though his body reminded him daily of the cost of years spent lifting what should not have been lifted. He moved slower now, favoring his left leg, shoulders slightly rounded from habit rather than weakness. His beard, trimmed close, framed a face that carried a permanent look of concentration, the kind born from a lifetime of solving problems quietly. Gus spoke little, but when he did, it was precise. He fixed small things, hinges, latches, a broken stool leg, choosing work that required patience more than strength. Purpose eased his pain more effectively than rest ever had. Maisie changed in smaller ways that mattered more. She no longer flinched at every unfamiliar sound. She left the porch without checking behind her. Her laughter still surprised her, arriving suddenly and stopping just as abruptly, but it came more often now. She followed Ethan around the farm with questions about the land, about the river, about why fences mattered even when no animals were inside them. She slept better when Coda lay near the doorway, his aging body stretched out like a living boundary between her and the world. Coda himself moved with the dignity of age. His muzzle was almost entirely silver now, and stares required thought. He did not rush. He did not play the way he once had, but his eyes remained clear, tracking change before it announced itself. He positioned himself with intention, near Maisie when strangers passed, near Ethan when paperwork arrived, near the gate each morning as if the road itself required supervision. The calm did not last. The letter arrived 3 days later, hand-delivered this time, not slipped anonymously into a mailbox. Ethan recognized the county seal before he opened it. A notice of a required community review, triggered by ongoing compliance concerns, and reported occupancy patterns inconsistent with zoning use. The language was careful, neutral, sharpened by distance. It did not accuse. It invited scrutiny. Gus read it slowly, lips pressed together. "This is the part where people stop pretending they don't see you," he said. Ethan nodded. He had expected this. Clearing the taxes had not erased attention, it had redirected it. The system did not like sudden stability where it had predicted collapse. Missoula's Grange Hall sat at the edge of town, a long, low building with warped floors and mismatched chairs that remembered more arguments than celebrations. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening, timed so working people could attend, and tired ones might choose not to. Ethan arrived early, Coda walking beside him on a loose leash, posture calm but unmistakably present. The room filled gradually. Farmers in worn jackets, retired couples who still believed meetings mattered, a few younger faces drawn by curiosity more than conviction. Gus and Maisie sat near the front, Maisie's hands folded tightly in her lap. Coda lay at her feet, eyes open, ears flicking at changes in tone. Sloane Wexler arrived last. She moved through the room with the same quiet confidence as before. Dark coat perfectly pressed, hair secured neatly at the nape of her neck. In this setting, under fluorescent lights and watchful eyes, her sharp features softened just enough to appear reasonable. Her gaze met Ethan's briefly. Cool, acknowledging, not hostile. This was not personal for her. That made it worse. When the meeting was called to order, a man named Arthur Bell took the front. He was in his early 60s, tall and narrow, with a long face and thinning hair combed carefully to one side. Arthur had been chairing community boards for decades, shaped by compromise and the belief that order prevented chaos. He spoke in measured tones, inviting comment, reminding everyone of procedure. Sloane spoke first. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She outlined concerns, liability, precedent, misuse of agricultural zoning. Her words were clean, well organized, difficult to argue without preparation. She ended with a familiar conclusion, that good intentions did not excuse irregular operations, and that allowing exceptions often created harm the system was designed to prevent. Ethan listened without interruption. Coda remained still. When it was his turn, Ethan stood. He did not bring notes. He did not bring promises. He spoke plainly. "This farm isn't a business," he said. "It isn't a shelter. It's a place where people stop long enough to get back on their feet. There are rules. No hiding, no long-term stays without paperwork. Work when you can. Leave when you're ready." A murmur moved through the room. Not agreement, not opposition. Recognition. Before Sloane could respond, a man near the back stood. His name was Daniel Cross, a broad-shouldered veteran in his early 50s with a beard gone unevenly gray and a left arm that moved slightly slower than the right. He spoke hesitantly at first, then steadier. "I stayed at Pine Hollow last winter," he said. 3 weeks. Ethan fixed my truck when it broke down, didn't charge me, just asked that I help clear brush. I did. I left with work lined up and my head straight." Another person stood, a woman named Ruth Keller, a retired nurse with short-cropped hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "His parents helped my sister years ago," she said. "No paperwork, no praise, just food and time. She's still alive because of it." One by one, people spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to change the shape of the room. Sloane's posture shifted. For the first time, calculation replaced certainty. Arthur Bell cleared his throat. "It seems," he said carefully, "that Pine Hollow has a history this board was not fully aware of. The discussion that followed was not easy. Conditions were proposed, oversight required, documentation mandated, limits drawn. Ethan accepted them without protest. Transparency was a fair price for legitimacy. The meeting ended without applause, no victory declared. But when people stood to leave, they looked at Ethan differently. Not as a problem, as a responsibility shared. Outside, the night air felt lighter. Gus released a breath he'd been holding all evening. Maisie leaned down to hug Coda, who accepted the gesture with tired patience. Sloane approached them near the door. Up close, the lines around her eyes were more visible, etched by years of measured decisions. "You won't get rich doing this," she said quietly. Ethan met her gaze. "I know." She studied him a moment longer, then nodded once. "Just don't make it harder than it needs to be." "I won't," Ethan said. "I'll make it honest." She left without another word. Back at Pine Hollow, the porch light cast a steady circle on the ground. Ethan stood there for a long moment, listening to the sounds of the farm settling, wood cooling, wind moving through the trees, Coda's steady breathing nearby. The pressure had not disappeared. It had changed shape. It now required consistency instead of fear, endurance instead of secrecy. Ethan understood that standing in the open did not mean standing without risk. It meant choosing which risks were worth carrying. Tonight, Pine Hollow stood not as a hidden refuge, but as a place willing to be seen. And for the first time, Ethan believed that might be enough. Spring did not arrive at Pine Hollow all at once. It came in increments, the way healing did. A warmer afternoon here, a patch of ground finally releasing its frost there. The river beyond the fields ran louder now, swollen and impatient, carrying winter away in long, cold ribbons. Grass pushed up where the snow had thinned, stubborn and green, indifferent to whether anyone noticed. Ethan noticed. Mornings no longer began with the quiet dread of tallying losses. They began with routine. Coffee strong enough to cut through sleep. Boots pulled on while the sky was still undecided. Coda waiting by the gate, posture dignified, his once black coat now threaded heavily with silver. The German shepherd moved slower these days, his joints stiff until warmth loosened them, but his eyes remained sharp. He had taken to resting against the old fence post near the road, chin lifted just enough to watch whoever approached. He didn't bark, he didn't challenge. He bore witness. The farm had settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than borrowed. Gus handled what he could without being asked. He kept records now, sitting at the small desk near the window where the light was best, his handwriting careful and precise. Years of working with timber had taught him patience and respect for structure, and he applied both to paperwork with surprising ease. His back still troubled him, especially in the mornings, but the stiffness eased once he had purpose. Pain, Ethan noticed, was quieter when it had somewhere to go. Maisie changed almost without anyone marking the moment. She laughed more freely now, the sound unguarded. Carrying across the yard when she ran with neighborhood children who had begun to drift over after school. Her hair stayed in a loose ponytail that bounced as she moved, strands escaping the tie without consequence. She spoke of school projects, of spelling tests, of a teacher who believed she could do more than survive. At night, she still slept better when Coda lay nearby, but she no longer needed to touch him to be sure he was there. The first new arrival came one afternoon with a hesitant knock and an old pickup that rattled like it had learned persistence the hard way. His name was Eli Parker, a man in his early 40s with a lean frame and a beard that looked like it had been trimmed by memory rather than habit. His eyes carried the hollow look of someone recently unmoored, but his posture was respectful. Careful not to ask for more than was offered, Ethan listened, asked a few questions, laid out the rules plainly. Eli stayed 2 nights, fixed a broken section of fence, and left with a lead on work downriver. No miracles, just motion. That became the pattern. People came quietly. They stayed briefly. They worked if they could. They left when they were ready. Pine Hollow did not advertise itself. It did not promise safety without effort. It offered time and honesty, nothing more. Oversight arrived as promised. Inspectors returned, this time with clipboards held less tightly. Forms were filed, limits observed. Arthur Bell stopped by once, standing near the barn with his hands in his coat pockets, surveying the repairs and the people moving with unhurried purpose. He nodded, said little, and left without finding fault. The system had not softened, it had adjusted. Sloane Wexler returned one final time. She arrived not in the SUV, but in a practical truck, its tires dusted with honest dirt. Her coat was still precise, her hair still neat, but something in her posture had changed. She walked the property slowly, eyes taking in the repaired roof, the cleared paths, the quiet order that had replaced chaos. When she stopped near Ethan, Coda rose from his place by the fence and stood beside him, close enough to be felt. You made your case, Sloane said, not with argument, with consistency. Ethan didn't respond right away. He watched Maisie helping Gus stack firewood, their movements uncoordinated but determined. He watched Coda's reflection in the window, older now, still vigilant. I won't stand in your way, Sloane continued. Just remember, systems don't forget. Ethan met her gaze. Neither do people, she nodded once, accepting the answer for what it was and left without ceremony. There was no victory in it, just resolution. Summer settled in gently. The days grew long, the evenings soft. Ethan found himself sitting on the porch more often, hands wrapped around a mug he didn't need, listening to the sounds of a place that had stopped bracing for loss. The money his parents had left dwindled steadily, redirected into permits, supplies, repairs. It never felt wasted. It felt used. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields gold, Ethan sat on the fence rail beside Coda. The dog leaned his weight gently against Ethan's leg, a familiar gesture that had once meant readiness and now meant something closer to peace. You did good, Ethan murmured, resting a hand on the coarse fur. Not because Coda needed praise, but because gratitude had nowhere else to go. Coda did not respond. He never had. He stayed. Autumn came with clear mornings and cool nights. Gus took on a small paid role with the county, cataloging tools for older farms transitioning ownership. The work suited him. Light, methodical, respectful of his limits. Maisie brought home a certificate from school one afternoon, her face bright with pride she didn't try to hide. Ethan hugged her awkwardly, sincerity making up for lack of grace. Time continued its quiet work. Coda slept more now, rising slowly, choosing rest over patrol. One morning, Ethan found him already at the gate, sitting upright despite the stiffness, watching the road with calm attention. Ethan stood beside him, the fence post cool against his palm. Someone always needs a place, Ethan said quietly. Coda's tail flicked once. Ethan understood then, with a clarity that brought both comfort and ache, that nothing here was permanent. Gus would age, Maisie would grow and leave. Coda would not sit at that gate forever. Pine Hollow itself would weather and change, but the choice would remain. His parents had not left him a fortune. They had left him permission. Permission to stay when leaving would have been easier. Permission to build something imperfect and still call it worthy. Permission to believe that choosing people was not weakness. As dusk settled and the first stars appeared, Ethan stayed where he was, the farm behind him alive with quiet purpose. The road ahead stretched open, but it no longer tempted him. He was no longer running. He was home. This story is not really about a farm or a hidden inheritance, or even a man who came home from war. It is about a choice, about choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier, choosing kindness when fear had every reason to win, choosing people when the world says people are a burden. So many of us wait for miracles that arrive loudly, sudden wealth, instant healing, perfect answers. But often, God works in quieter ways. Sometimes the miracle is the strength to remain. Sometimes it is a heart that softens instead of hardening. Sometimes it is a loyal presence beside us, guiding us toward what is right when we feel empty and afraid. In our daily lives, faith is rarely dramatic. It shows up in ordinary moments, in patience, in compassion, in choosing love when no one is watching. And when we do, broken places slowly become steady, and wounded lives find room to breathe again. If this story touched you, perhaps it mirrors something in your own life. Maybe you are being asked to stay, to care, or to believe again. Please share this story with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what this story reminded you of, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories that heal. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps. May He give you peace where there is worry, strength where there is weariness, and light for the road ahead.